Greetings and welcome to Elephant TV. My name is Joe Kobuthi. Today I'll be speaking to Canon Francis Omondi. Canon is a clergyman here in Kenya. He's also a lecturer, a writer, and a public intellectual. Welcome, Canon, to the Elephant.
Thank you, Joe. How are you?
Very well.
Great.
Canon, Mahmoud Mamdani wrote a book that was published in 2020 titled Neither Settler Nor Native. And in it he talks about the idea of permanent minorities, where by how the state was manufactured, it creates permanent minorities. And in a recent article, you've used a lot of his work to explain how this has been within the Kenyan context. In your view, what's the history of permanent minorities within the Kenyan context, and how has it affected our politics?
Okay, Mamdani in his book analyzes how the British and other colonial powers created permanent minorities and how this could be unmade. He pointed out how the British, particularly beginning their rule, there were not as many, but they were ruling vast empires that required them to engineer something, which was the indirect rule, which was not unique to the British. The Romans had done this before. But Mamdani points out at the genius of the British, that they did not impose imperial culture immediately on the people, but used the people's own cultures and fragmented the tribes that apparently were big, retaining them in their cultures, reimagining their history, and then putting friction between one tribe against the other, and in the process was able to rule them. This happened in India, where they went on to do the indigenous cultures, and they brought that same to Kenya. In Kenya, the story was a little different. When they came, they found the two major tribes, the Luo, the Kikuyus, and the other tribes that formed in. They then emphasized the differences between our various tribes. And in doing so, they were then able to rule for the period of independence. Remember, most of the independent political parties worked towards unifying the country away from tribes. They bridged the gaps between tribes to undermine what the British had created. The nature of this was that each tribe was given its own reserve, each tribe was given its own laws that was subservient to the main laws. But then the the colonialists, the settlers, were allowed to have the civil law, which was put above the others. So each tribe were to be defined in their own ways, with their chiefs, with their laws, and to be ruled, to be able to be given lozenges and goodies within their tribes, and spark jealousy of other tribes and on. Much more making each community a little different from the other, but making them almost want to fight. So in the initial stage, the forefathers were fighting against colonialism, worked towards bridging this. And that's why parties like KANU had almost everyone in it, and particularly the two major tribes, bridge the gap to fight colonialism. However, when independence was achieved, this became an area of difficulties, because the promises that were given towards independence were not achieved. And so the budding political parties that were coming not from particular tribes, but through labor unions and through other associations, either in regions, began putting pressure on KANU. And we saw this after 67, 66, when there was ideological difference on how to apportion, how to rule this country, that made Mr. Jaramogi Odinga form KPU, joined with Bildad Kagia and others. Kenyatta then decided to use the British own method of amalgamating, creating a majority and making the rest of the country minority. And this was in 1969 when he spearheaded the formation of GEMA, forming the Kikuyu, Embu and Meru as a voting bloc, which apparently had the this was a bigger population than any single unit in the country, although the rest of the country put together were bigger than them. But this minority became then the rulers and the authoritarian group that now drove the national politics, and then accumulated the majority of resources, state resources, were now spearheaded development, as we call it, were now brought in the regions where these people ruled. In essence, making the rest of the country minorities. So Kenyatta created kind of a permanent minority, such that every election coming, the GEMA had the tyranny of numbers, that they always ruled. This, though, changed when Moi became president after Kenyatta's death. Although people thought this was something that would pass, but he actually came in. But after 82 coup, he sat very firmly in his position. But Moi created his own minorities, realizing that he did not have the tribal backing like Gema, coming from a small tribe, the Tugen, who had already been amalgamated into Kalenjin tribe by the colonialists. He now reached out to other Rift Valley tribes, bringing the Maasai, the Samburu, and to form the and the Turkana to form the Kamatusa, such that within the Rift Valley they were a juggernaut that could counter the impact of Gema on one hand, and also manage the Abaluhia and the Luos on the other end. So in him creating out of a minority made the rest of the country also a minority. But it was again a minority that was ruling the majority people. And to them they got the bulk of the government resources, what we call development, the great investment that the country had was geared towards this. Moise followed Mamdani's also thought, what Mamdani observed in creation of homelands. And in the creation of homelands, they wanted to zone off the country, that certain areas that supported Moi became, were gifted with government investment and government support and access to power. And this is how we saw portions of the coast, a large chunk of the Rift Valley, and also selected parts of the other countries also enjoying the gifts that Moi had given. So in this way, Moi created his own minorities that ruled with him. The challenge that these two regimes posed was in creating permanent minorities, they excluded the rest of the countries. You remember Moi saying that siasa mbaya, maisha mbaya. Siasa mbaya technically meant, the bad politics meant not supporting Moi. You would suffer the consequence. So they excluded those who did not give Moi support, and they rewarded those who came on to support Moi, so that schools, hospitals, roads were more given to areas where his rule, people were willing to support him. Jomo Kenyatta gave us then the logic of using tribe as a political tool for political parties. such that during his time, KANU was really a Kikuyu party. When now Moi comes in, the logic shifts, and it's the Kalenjin and those affiliated tribes that become the dominant in this. And every other person then is pushed on the periphery to find their own. Although bringing the country under one-party state, those who were ruling, those who really mattered, were an elite group that he handily selected and allowed to run. So this being the history, we then had a challenge in the country that corruption could go on unabated. Favoritism would go on as abated. The government was not accountable to anyone as long as you were in these blocks. So this was the rankers that led then later to the issues that forced people. We do not want this single state, a single party state. We want multi-party. People thought through multi-party we could push pressure and have more Kenyans included in power, and power resources of the country equitably distributed and shared. That led us to the 202 revolution, where majority of Kenyans, when they gathered under NAC, people realized that even putting the Kalenjin alone were not enough to rule the country. The majority was actually out, and Kikuyu's vote was split. The Gema vote was split then, and people saw that this was the situation. Unfortunately, after taking power, people reverted back to the to the tribal logic. It was so difficult to really go out because they felt that without having security of your tribe, we didn't trust Kenyans that we can operate without that tribal logic, either ruling the country and ruling the state. We got then the Constitution 2010, which was like a social contract that was to give people the contours of how powers should be shared, how resources should be shared. But even with this, we still had the feeling that certain places where the rulers came from, where the power resided, got more resources than the rest. You remember the famous time to eat and on. The country still was governed by that tribal logic. The social contract was held in one hand, but what the logic that drove us was still tribal. You saw it in appointments of position, where Chapter 6 was meant to look for ethics. We weren't looking for ethics, we were looking for more security of votes. And that became the key to 2013 election. That again, the tribal blocking became true. We still saw the TNA and the URP, both Kalenjin and Kikuyu, forming up the tyranny of numbers, which has been doubted that they actually were. But you see, there's always suppression of the real population, because census, because that was what the British also used, and more used, because we are not still sure that the census are actually accurate, and many are still have a feeling that these census are doctored to really justify certain historic positions, and to foresee what would happen in politics. So we have the politics of population, politics of regions, but all driven by the logic of tribe. This, to me, is the greatest boon and the greatest undoing of Kenyan politics, such that the Constitution, though he said we Kenyans, did not obliterate the whole notion of people driven by the tribal logic or the ethnic logic.
I mean, granted, Canon, what you're saying, my own sense of this whole situation is that as we approach into the 2022 elections, there are, in a sense, two very fundamental questions that you've answered in your article, and the other has been answered by Dr. David D, the economist. On one hand, you're asking Kenyans to the question, how ought we live together? And on the other hand, David D is asking Kenyans, how do we live together sustainably? The economic question. What's your take on this on these two particular questions? How would you frame them such that they don't become two separate questions, but one thing together?
Well, the logic of state has been the main way that people rally and live in a society, a community like Kenya. So we thought that if we have a strong state with good laws, this would help us live together. We thought that if we had a state that would be law-abiding and follow with a good constitution, then people will coherently work and develop for everyone. We've realized that state is about power, and power has a zero-sum game. When I have it, someone else has less of it. And so this has been the challenge, that when we amass power, then it's easy to abuse power. And even law does not, from our experience, the law doesn't restrain power. On the other hand, if we go towards market, which is the other option, the state power has been sought for to support the market. And market has been mainly capitalistic market, where people accumulate, acquire wealth, and prosper in that process. What possibly David D is saying, how do we bring this prosperity to everyone? But the nature of our market is capitalistic, which where those with means and those with capital tend to exploit and take advantage of every other person. There is nothing that restrains them. And most of these things have been legally done. So state and power are two ways in which we've expressed ourselves in trying to form communities or form our country. But I learned from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs when he writes in his book, The Home We Build Together, that it's something, to form a society will need to go beyond state and beyond the market to find a third option, which he terms morality. It's morality that gives us the burden to seek justice, to seek equity, to find out where the other person is, such that what I have, the other person would also have. Is morality that will give me the burden to consider that someone has slept hungry, and as a fellow human being, he ought to have eaten. This logic will not be found in state formation, but it will be found in the character of the people forming the nation. It is this morality that should drive us forward. In his book, he writes that, yes, state can be formed towards through the quest for morality, because it's now this that should now drive us into forming state. A state that is moral would make sure every of its citizens have medicine, every of its citizens have food, every of its citizens is cared for. But we cannot achieve this because with social contract. He proposes that the only way we can achieve a moral society is through covenant. Covenant presupposes the equality of people, that I view you as equal to me, and things I would desire, you too would desire. And we covenant ourselves that we will abide by these rules. It won't be law that makes us to do it, but it will be something from within. The idea is that Jonathan Sachs postulates were already thought through before and were implemented in our region, in our neighborhood, Tanzania, because Nyerere's own Arusha Declaration was building a nation on Utu. Utu, or he later termed this as Ubuntu. When he thought that, when he came to a realization that his country was getting, the inequality of his country was reaching a great height, he thought that he should develop and build an egalitarian society where each citizen would have the same access to resources and use that resources according to their ability. That's what led to 1967 Arusha Declaration that brought the idea of Ujamaa. At the center of this was the Utu, that every human being should be treated as a brother. Every human being should be my sister. Every human being should share the resources that are for our common good. It's this that led him to develop policies of the villages, communal, because he felt that if you are my Jamaa, if you are my family, I would want the best for you. The reason why tribalism is undermined in that country is that it made every tribe the same with the other. There was no particular tribe of the leaders, but it was the ideology that led rather than the tribal logic. So driving the country through Ubuntu logic or Utu logic led him to establish a more egalitarian society. Though poor, as we may call them, they managed to build a cohesive society where one would live anywhere and where one would be appointed or be appraised or be supported because he is a Tanzanian. There's nothing defeating us from imbuing or copying some of these principles for our countries today, because we've now trusted both. Where man eat man has led us to heights of inequalities, we've seen on the other side a more cohesive society, peaceful and moving forward.
So, I mean, as a church in Kenya, I mean, statistics tell us that 80% of Kenyans are Christians. What do you think is its place in redesigning this kind of society, where the cornerstone is moral leadership, utu na ubinadamu, as Nyerere called it? Do you think that the church has institutional and also just human capacity factoring its history as a colonial edifice, but also now, when as we move towards 2022, where increasingly we're beginning to see a couple of things are shifting in Kenya. One, in a sense, where, as David Graeber calls it, we're moving from, in a sense, a feudal society previously with capitalistic tendencies. Now we are becoming a truly capitalistic country where, elections manifestos are centering on, things. So one party is saying we'll do 1, 2, 3, and the other party is saying we'll do 1, 2, 3. Really centering on really, as you said, really capitalistic ideas of how a state should be run. So do you think within this context, the religious sector, the church broadly, but even the Muslim brothers and sisters can infuse a kind of moral logic into reimagining a society that Kenyans are aspiring for?
Well, it's disappointing in a way that the religious sector has always been touted as the moral conscience of the society. But what that means to different religious outfits really matter. We've not prodded to ask ourselves in the religious what these truly mean. I will hinge it on the idea that we've always imported our theologies and never wanted to develop theology from within our context. And I think the time we begin to do that, we will begin to question and push the society to where it ought to be. It's not difficult, it's not different. And I'm glad that it's now beginning to happen with clergy and scholars, clerical scholars like me, who are now beginning to push and ask questions of the theologies we inherited. We too were caught up in that web of tribal logic. It's seen in the practice of churches, it's seen in the practice of how we live in our society. And this tribal logic has spread into our divide in religious kind of denominations, as well as interreligious relations, that we've always felt others are not part of us. But within all our religions, there is that call to honor fellow human beings because they're made in the image of God, or God honors them. No religion hinders from doing good to people in desperate need. But it beats logic that we were singing and praying for leaders who were carrying bathwater, I would say, of the tribal leaders. And whatever evil they were doing, we were blind to it. Even to this very day, of course, a few revolted and raised those questions. But we want to see more today. The problem is that in our times today, the church is hidden on those who give them resources. If people are giving to the church abstains from criticizing them. And we've seen this across board, that those who are generous to the church have escaped the scrutiny that ought to have been done. What I'm proposing in this is that we must come back as the church to find what moral position should be for this nation, and what is that universal common good that can be common across religions, and push this into the societal debate. No one is bringing the moral debate into the discourse of politics or any other thing, and this should be our greatest contribution. I'm thrilled that in the early 60s into the 70s, clergymen, Oscar Romero and Gustavo Gutierrez in Latin America, faced with a situation just like ours, inequality and political excesses, designed to ask that no, God is on the side of the poor, the victimized, and stood by them, designed their policies towards them. Of course, they faced the wrath of the rest of the church and community, who called them liberation theologians, and therefore called them communists, and were not ready to accommodate what they were. I mean, the thoughts they were bringing forward. We now, and that was a moral kind of leadership that they forced countries in Latin America to begin to change and to focus on the poor. We too need to do that. At the level of poverties that we have in this country, we can't afford to be sanctimonious and religious without working out ways of mitigating the poverty in this country. Because those who become poor, those who become excluded, those who are suffering these inequalities and therefore violence would be members of our own churches. This problem is now with us, and we must face it headlong and force this debate to the politicians, rather than force ourselves to get push-ins from politicians.
Practically, even as we're moving, August, the elections are coming here. September, we have to come back together as a society. How do we begin to answer your question practically? What do we now need to do to now move from a space of asking a question of how do we live together? What steps should we now start making as a society to answer those questions, but also build institutions, ideas around this, such that we're able to now is able to manifest this question that you're asking.
One element that I see very feasible actually was propagated by President Uhuru Kenyatta. Remember at the burial of Mudavadi's mother, he came out openly, and I felt it was very clever of him to begin saying that not two tribes should govern this country all these years. The period of 2010 to now gave us the hardware, but the software that should run this program should be removing tribalism from the tribal logic, as I should call it, from our society. And that will be what will give us an edge towards working and replace that with moral logic. The moral logic would be what would help us. Although Kenyatta pointed that, judging was a benefactor of tribalism, and he also in his way perpetuated it. But maybe he learned that this isn't the way the country should run. And credit to him that he tried to do that. My challenge, even I'm seeing Azimio, what Azimio has done, they've used a very good word that Nyerere used, Azimio la Arusha. But do they have the spirit that drove Nyerere to think of Utu? Because I'm already seeing some within the critic that people are laying out, that Azimio is a collection of tribal chiefs that are gathering up to push on this country according to tribes. My worry and my prayer is that they do not also create their own minorities. And the avoidance of creating minorities is to have all Kenyans be seen as individuals who have equal rights, whether they voted for Azimio or not, but to see that everywhere every Kenyan lives needed security, needs road, needs water, and they should do that without any avoidance of doubt or thinking whether those people supported them or not. Because what affects one community affects us. We must begin to see that the logic that builds us is not our religion, it's not our tribe, but our common humanity and our common good, the common good that we hold in this country. I saw also in the manifesto, say, of UDA or the Kenya Kwanza, while it's painting what they will do economically, the challenge is economy alone does not work towards bringing cohesion among Kenyans. And this is what, and it's still carrying on in that tribal logic, because they also zoned the country, that this is our strongholds, these are our areas. My bias is to see our politics detoxed and removed of this tribal logic. And we begin to see we have a country that puts all of us together. If it sinks, we all sink. And this, to me, is the message I would like to bring to the political class. Look, draft your policies, but think away from tribal logic and begin to consider this moral logic. That is the language of justice. That is the language of fairness. That's the language of inclusion. And also equitably the distribution of resources among us.
Thank you, Reverend, for your time here at the Elephant.
Thank you.
Asante sana.